Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Ray Donovan's beachfront apartment in Key Largo, Florida. At 40, Ray had the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, deep laugh lines around his eyes, sun-bronzed skin, and the lean, sinewy build of a career diver. He rolled out of bed, checking his watch. 5:45 a.m. Perfect timing to prepare for the day's first dive class. Ray had moved to the Florida Keys 15 years ago after leaving his accounting job in Chicago. What had started as a vacation to escape, a particularly brutal winter, had turned into a complete life change when he discovered scuba diving. The underwater world had called to him in a way nothing in his previous life ever had. Now, as the owner of Blue Water Diving, he spent his days introducing others to the magic beneath the waves. He shuffled into the kitchen of his modest apartment, brewing a pot of strong coffee while reviewing the day's schedule on his tablet. 6 tourists for the morning dive at Molasses Reef, followed by an afternoon advanced certification class with 3 students at French Reef. Routine stuff, but he never tired of it. His phone buzzed with a text from Mike, his boat captain and business partner. Engine trouble. Mechanic coming at 10, afternoon only today. Ray frowned, typing back, clients already confirmed for morning dive. Can't reschedule. The reply came quickly. Call Seastar Charters? They might have space. Ray sighed and dialed Seastar's number, but as expected, they were fully booked. He couldn't cancel on his clients. 2 were flying back to Minnesota tomorrow, and the others had specifically requested this date months ago for an anniversary celebration. We'll take the Mako, he texted Mike, referring to his smaller 25-foot backup boat that they rarely used for client dives. It wasn't ideal, more cramped, fewer amenities, but it would do in a pinch. No good, Mike replied. Fuel pump issue, remember? Parts coming Tuesday. Ray swore under his breath. Equipment problems were the bane of any marine business, especially in a place as remote as the Keys, where parts often took days to arrive. He considered his options while gulping down his coffee. He could try to find another charter company to take his clients, but it was peak season and everyone was booked solid. Canceling would mean refunds and disappointed clients who might leave bad reviews, the lifeblood of a small operation like his. There was one other option. The dive site was only about a mile offshore. He could take the clients out in 2 trips using the small inflatable dinghy he kept for emergencies and personal dives. It would be a hassle, and they'd be cramped, but it would work. Ray finished his coffee, made a quick breakfast of toast and eggs, then loaded his personal dive gear into his Jeep. The morning air was thick with humidity as he drove the short distance to the marina where his company operated from a small storefront sandwiched between a bait shop and a tourist trap t-shirt store. When he arrived, he was surprised to see Ali, his part-time dive instructor, already there preparing equipment. "You're early," he said, unlocking the shop door. Ali, a former marine biology student who had fallen in love with the Keys just as Ray had, looked up from the tank she was inspecting. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get a head start on the gear check. Good timing, we've got a situation." Ray explained the boat problems and his dinghy solution. Ali frowned. "The dinghy? For 6 clients plus us? That's pushing it, Ray." 2 trips, he clarified. "You take 3 out, I'll follow with the other 3. Not ideal, but better than canceling." She looked skeptical but nodded. "If you think it'll work." By 7:30 a.m., their clients had arrived. The anniversary couple, Bob and Carol Fletcher from Tampa, both in their 50s but fit and experienced divers, and the 4 friends from Minnesota, Tom and Sarah Johnson, and Mark and Heather Wilson, all in their 30s and relatively new to diving, having completed their certification just last year. Ray explained the situation, putting the best spin on it. "Think of it as a more intimate, personalized experience," he said with his practiced, reassuring smile. "Same great dive site, just a more adventurous journey getting there." To his relief, the clients took it in stride. The Minnesota group even seemed excited by the slight change in plans, viewing it as an authentic Keys experience. By 8:15, they were ready to depart. Ali would take the first group, the Fletchers and Tom Johnson, while Ray would follow with the remaining 3 Minnesotans. The plan was to meet at the mooring buoy at Molasses Reef, one of the most popular dive sites in the Keys, known for its vibrant coral formations and abundant marine life. "See you there in 20, Ray said, as Ali pushed off from the dock, the small outboard motor of the dinghy sputtering to life. While waiting for Ali to return with the dinghy, Ray chatted with the remaining clients, going over the dive plan one more time. Sarah, a kindergarten teacher with an infectious enthusiasm, couldn't contain her excitement about potentially seeing a sea turtle. Mark, a software developer with a methodical approach to everything, was more interested in the technical aspects of the dive. His wife, Heather, a nurse with a calm, observant demeanor, seemed content to take in the beauty of the morning, watching pelicans dive for fish near the dock. Ray's phone buzzed with a text from Ali. "At the buoy, all good. Water visibility excellent." 40 minutes later, Ray was guiding his 3 clients through the crystal-clear waters of Molasses Reef. The visibility was indeed exceptional, at least 80 feet, allowing them to appreciate the full splendor of the coral formations that gave the Florida Keys their reputation as America's most accessible reef system. The dive went flawlessly. They spotted a loggerhead turtle, just as Sarah had hoped, along with a squadron of spotted eagle rays, a nurse shark resting under a coral ledge, and countless tropical fish darting among the colorful coral. Ray kept a careful eye on his less experienced clients, but they maintained good buoyancy control and air consumption. After about 50 minutes, they ascended to 15 feet for their safety stop, then surfaced near the mooring buoy, where Ali was already helping the first group back into the dinghy. "Perfect timing," she called out. "How was it?" "Fantastic," Sarah gushed, removing her regulator. "We saw a turtle." The group exchanged stories as they took turns climbing back into the small boat. With all 6 clients and Ali aboard, the dinghy was now significantly overloaded for the return journey. "I'll swim back," Ray decided aloud. "It's only a mile and it's a beautiful day." Before anyone could protest, he added, "I do this all the time, good exercise." This wasn't entirely true. While Ray occasionally swam moderate distances to maintain his fitness, swimming all the way back to shore wasn't his regular practice. But the water was calm, the current was minimal, and he was an excellent swimmer. Plus, he was still wearing his 3mm wetsuit, which provided some buoyancy. "Are you sure?" Ali asked, concern evident in her voice. "I can make 2 trips." "Absolutely," Ray insisted. "No point in burning extra fuel. I'll probably beat you back anyway." He grinned confidently. "The channel's deeper on the eastern side, so I'll take that route. Might get to see some more marine life on the way." "If you say so," Ali replied, still sounding uncertain. Everyone's gear is stowed properly. After confirming all was secure, Ali started the outboard motor, and the overloaded dinghy began its slow journey back to shore. Ray treaded water, watching them go, then oriented himself toward the distant shoreline. He took a few deep breaths, adjusted his mask, and began swimming with strong, measured strokes. The first quarter-mile was pleasant. The water was a perfect 82 degrees, clear enough that he could see the sandy bottom about 30 feet below him. Schools of ballyhoo skimmed across the surface ahead of him, and a pair of remoras briefly took interest in him before darting away. As he approached the halfway point, the seafloor beneath him began to drop away as he crossed over the edge of Hawk Channel, a natural deep-water passage that ran parallel to the Keys. The bottom was now closer to 60 feet below, and the water had taken on a deeper blue hue. Ray felt the first twinges of fatigue in his shoulders, but pushed on steadily. He was swimming directly over the channel now, the seafloor now barely visible below. This was where larger predators sometimes patrolled. Nothing particularly dangerous, usually just barracuda or the occasional reef shark. Still, Ray found himself glancing down more frequently, a primal instinct to check for threats below. About 3/4 of a mile from his starting point, Ray paused to rest, treading water as he caught his breath. The shore was clearly visible now, perhaps a quarter-mile away. He could make out the distinctive blue awning of his dive shop and a few boats moving along the coastline. As he was about to resume swimming, he felt something. A subtle change in water pressure, a sixth sense developed over thousands of dives. He dipped his face into the water, scanning below. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the deep blue of the channel. Then a movement caught his eye. A large, streamlined shape moving slowly about 40 feet below him. The distinctive tiger-striped pattern was unmistakable. A tiger shark, and a large one at that, probably 12 feet long. Ray's pulse quickened, but he remained calm. Tiger sharks weren't uncommon in the Keys, though they typically stayed in deeper waters. They had a reputation as one of the more dangerous shark species, but attacks were extremely rare. Still, he knew the protocol. Maintain visual contact, don't splash excessively, and swim steadily toward shore. The shark showed no interest in him, continuing its unhurried patrol of the channel. Ray began swimming again, more deliberately now, keeping his kicks smooth and regular. He resisted the urge to swim faster, knowing that panicked movements could potentially trigger the shark's predatory instincts. For several minutes, the situation remained unchanged. Ray, swimming steadily toward shore, occasionally glancing down to see the tiger shark maintaining its distance below him. Then, without warning, the shark changed direction, angling upward in a leisurely ascent. Ray felt his heart rate spike. The shark wasn't charging, not yet, but its behavior had shifted from indifference to interest. He continued swimming, forcing himself to maintain the same measured pace while mentally calculating the remaining distance to shore. Still at least 400 yards, too far to sprint, especially with his energy already partially depleted. When he looked down again, the shark had closed half the distance between them and was continuing to rise. Ray could now clearly see its features: the blunt snout, the coldly intelligent eyes, the powerful tail propelling it effortlessly through the water. There was no mistaking the predatory intent in its movement. In that moment, Ray made a decision. That would later haunt him. Rather than continuing straight to shore, he angled toward a small patch reef about 100 yards to his right. If he could reach it, he might be able to stand on it, getting most of his body out of the water until the shark lost interest or help arrived. He altered his course, swimming more rapidly now, abandoning the measured pace he had maintained. Below him, the shark responded immediately to the change, accelerating its ascent, its body language shifting from curiosity to pursuit. Ray swam harder, adrenaline flooding his system. The patch reef was getting closer, but so was the shark. He could almost feel it behind him now, though he didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed for him to kick faster, to thrash his way to safety. But his professional training overrode the panic. Excessive splashing would only make him more attractive as prey. He was perhaps 30 yards from the reef when he felt it, a sudden surge in the water behind him. Without conscious thought, Ray tucked into a ball and rolled to his right, an instinctive evasive maneuver. The shark shot past him, close enough that its rough skin scraped along his wetsuit. It had missed its initial strike, but Ray knew it would circle back quickly. Tiger sharks were persistent hunters, known for their tenacity. He dove down toward the reef, hoping to reach the coral structure before the shark circled back, the fee. Water around the reef was shallower, perhaps 15 feet deep, with coral heads rising to within a few feet of the surface. If he could position himself among the coral formations, the shark might have difficulty maneuvering for another attack. Ray reached the edge of the reef just as the shark completed its turn. He could see it clearly now, perhaps 20 yards away, swimming in a tight circle before orienting toward him again. He found a position between two large coral heads, placing his back against one for protection while facing outward. The tiger shark approached more cautiously this time, circling the reef perimeter. Ray remained as still as possible, controlling his breathing, knowing that any movement or air bubbles might trigger another charge. For what seemed like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, a tense standoff ensued, the shark circling, Ray waiting, each assessing the other. Then, with a powerful sweep of its tail, the shark darted forward into the coral labyrinth. Ray kicked upward, trying to ascend over a coral ridge, but his fin caught momentarily in a crevice. That split-second delay was all the shark needed. The initial impact felt like being hit by a truck. The shark struck him from below and to the right, its mouth clamping around his thigh and hip. The pressure was enormous, driving the air from Ray's lungs in a cloud of bubbles. There was a strange disconnect. Tremendous pressure, but in the first instant no pain, just the horrifying sensation of teeth penetrating his wetsuit, then his skin, then scraping against bone. The shark shook its head violently, the characteristic behavior meant to tear flesh from bone. That's when the pain hit, white-hot and all-consuming. Ray's training evaporated in an instant of primal terror and agony. He screamed into his regulator, a stream of bubbles erupting as seawater rushed into his mouth. Acting on pure instinct, Ray drove his fist into the shark's gills, then gouged at its eye with his thumb. The shark released its grip momentarily, enough for Ray to pull away and scramble higher onto the coral structure, ignoring the sharp edges cutting into his hands and his uninjured leg. Blood clouded the water around him, his blood spreading in an expanding crimson plume. The shark circled tightly now, agitated by the scent. Ray knew he had only moments before it attacked. Again. He pulled himself higher onto the coral, getting his torso above water but unable to lift his injured leg, which felt leaden and unresponsive. The tiger shark charged again, this time striking at his dangling leg. Ray screamed as teeth sank into his calf. He hammered at the shark's snout with his free foot, connecting solidly enough that the animal released him again. But the damage was devastating. Ray could see through the bloody water that his calf muscle had been shredded, white bone visible through the torn flesh. Shock began to set in, a strange detachment spreading through him even as the pain reached impossible levels. Ray knew he was in critical danger, not just from the shark, but from blood loss. He needed to apply pressure to his wounds, but he couldn't take his eyes off the circling predator, now working itself into a feeding frenzy, driven by the blood in the water. In the distance, Ray heard the sound of an outboard motor, someone approaching. He tried to call out, but his voice was weak, the sound carried away by the light breeze. The shark charged a third time, but now Ray had managed to pull himself almost entirely onto the coral platform, leaving only his mangled legs in the water. The Dios shark struck again, but without the leverage of deep water. Its attack was less effective. It thrashed at Ray's feet, tearing away one of his fins and lacerating his already wounded calf, but couldn't get a solid grip. After several seconds of frenzied thrashing, it backed away, circling once more, assessing. The sound of the outboard grew louder. Ray turned his head weakly, seeing a fishing boat approaching from the direction of the shore. He waved a feeble arm, not sure if they had spotted him. The tiger shark made one final half-hearted pass, its dorsal fin cutting the surface as it swam parallel to the reef. Then, with a powerful sweep of its tail, it disappeared into deeper water, perhaps deterred by the approaching boat or simply moving on to easier prey. Ray collapsed onto the coral, one arm dangling in the bloodied water. His vision began to tunnel, consciousness slipping away as the fishing boat drew nearer. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was a shout from the boat. "Holy shit! Get the first aid kit!" When Ray next became aware of his surroundings, he was lying on the deck of a fishing boat, two men working frantically over him. One was applying pressure to his thigh with what looked like a wadded-up t-shirt, now soaked through with blood. The other was on a radio, his voice tense as he communicated with the Coast Guard. "Male, approximately 40, severe shark attack injuries to right leg, major blood loss. We're heading to Whale Harbor Marina, need ambulance standing by." Ray tried to speak, but could manage only a weak groan. The man applying pressure to his leg, middle-aged, deeply tanned with a salt and pepper beard, glanced at his face. "He's conscious," the man called to his companion. Then to Ray. "Hang tight, buddy. Coast Guard's sending a chopper, but we're gonna get you to shore first. Try not to move." Ray nodded slightly, then winced as a wave of pain washed over him. He could now see the full extent of his injuries. His right thigh had deep, gaping wounds where the shark's teeth had penetrated, and his calf was mangled almost beyond recognition, hanging in tatters. "Tiger shark," Ray managed to whisper. "Yeah. We saw it from a distance," the bearded man replied grimly. "Big one, you're lucky to be alive." "My boat," Ray began, but the man cut him off. "Don't worry about that now. Just stay with me, okay? What's your name?" Ray Donovan. I run blue water diving." Recognition flickered in the man's eyes. "I know your shop. I'm Jim Reeves. This is my brother-in-law, Pete." Pete, still on the radio, gave Ray a tight nod without pausing his conversation with the Coast Guard. "How bad?" Ray asked, though he could see the answer in Jim's eyes. "Pretty bad, but we've got tourniquets on. Just hang tight." The boat was moving at full throttle now, bouncing over the small chop. Each impact sent spikes of agony through Ray's leg, but he clenched his teeth, focusing on staying conscious. He knew that passing out again could be dangerous. "My clients," he said, suddenly remembering. "Allie, we'll call your shop when we get to shore," Jim assured him. "Right now we focus on getting you help." The journey to Whale Harbor Marina passed in a blur of pain and fading consciousness for Ray. He was vaguely aware of Pete checking his pulse regularly, of Jim maintaining pressure on his wounds while speaking encouragingly, and of the gradual approach of land. As they neared the marina, he could hear sirens in the distance, the ambulance already responding to the Coast Guard's relay. Pete maneuvered the boat skillfully to the fuel dock, where a small crowd had gathered, alerted by radio chatter about the shark attack. The next few minutes were chaos. Paramedics swarming aboard, IV lines being established, pressure bandages replacing Jim's improvised tourniquets. Ray heard fragments of their assessment. Massive tissue damage, femoral artery intact, thank God. BP dropping, get a line in now. He was lifted onto a stretcher, the movement sending fresh waves of agony through his mangled leg. As they carried him from the boat to the waiting ambulance, he caught glimpses of shocked faces in the crowd. Someone was taking photos with a smartphone. Someone else was asking the paramedics questions, perhaps a local reporter. In the ambulance, an oxygen mask was placed over his face, and he felt the prick of a needle in his arm. Morphine, a paramedic explained, noticing his questioning look. Should help with the pain soon. Ray nodded weakly, then turned to look out the ambulance window as they pulled away from the marina. In the distance, he could see a Coast Guard helicopter approaching, presumably the one originally dispatched for him. As the morphine began to take effect, dulling the worst of the pain, Ray's thoughts turned to the shark. It hadn't been hunting him specifically. He had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, an intrusion into the creature's domain. There was no malice in what had happened, just the implacable machinery of nature, the ancient dance of predator and prey that had been playing out in the world's oceans for millions of years before humans ever ventured into the water. The ambulance sped down the overseas highway, sirens wailing. Ray's consciousness began to fade again, the morphine pulling him toward a merciful darkness. His last coherent thought before surrendering to unconsciousness was a strange one, not of fear or pain or regret, but of what he had glimpsed in the shark's eye in that frozen moment before the first attack. Nothing. No emotion, no hunger, no hate. Just the black, empty stare of a perfect predator doing what millions of years of evolution had designed it to do. The next thing Ray was aware of was the steady beep of medical equipment and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. He opened his eyes slowly, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lighting. A nurse noticed he was awake and approached his bedside. "Welcome back, Mr. Donovan," she said, checking one of the monitors beside his bed. "You're at Mariners Hospital in Tavernier. Do you remember what happened?" Ray's throat was dry, making speech difficult. The nurse offered him a small sip of water through a straw. "Shark attack," he managed after drinking. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, weak and scratchy. "That's right," she confirmed. "You were brought in yesterday afternoon with severe injuries to your right leg. You've had surgery and multiple blood transfusions. The doctor will be in shortly to explain everything." Ray glanced down at his body. Most of him was covered by a hospital gown and blanket, but he could see that his right leg was elevated, heavily bandaged from hip to ankle. He tried to wiggle his toes but couldn't tell if they moved or not. His entire leg felt strangely disconnected, present yet not present like a phantom limb. "My leg?" he asked, afraid of the answer. The nurse's expression grew more serious. "The doctor will discuss your injuries in detail, but you should know they were able to save your leg. It was touch and go for a while." Relief flooded through. Ray followed immediately by concern about the extent of the damage. Before he could ask more questions, the door opened and a doctor entered. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Dr. Patel." "You're a very lucky man," she said without preamble, picking up his chart and scanning it briefly. "The shark missed your femoral artery by millimeters. If it had severed that, you likely would have bled out before reaching shore." "How bad is it?" Ray asked, bracing himself. Dr. Patel didn't sugarcoat it. "You've sustained severe damage to the muscles and soft tissue of your right thigh and calf. Multiple deep lacerations, some down to the bone. We had to surgically repair what we could and remove some tissue that was beyond salvaging. You'll need additional surgeries, and the recovery will be lengthy." "Will I walk again?" The question that had been haunting him since he awoke. "Most likely yes, though not without significant rehabilitation. I won't lie to you. You'll probably have a permanent limp and you may need a cane for stability. Your days of scuba diving are." She hesitated, then finished more gently. "Going to be on hold for quite some time." Ray absorbed this in silence. The pain was returning now as whatever painkillers they had him on began to wear off. "There's something else," Dr. Patel continued. The sheriff's department has officers waiting to speak with you when you're up to it. There's been significant media interest in your case. Shark attacks make headlines, especially in a tourist area." As if on cue, the door opened again, and a tall man in a Monroe County Sheriff's Department uniform stepped in. "Doctor, if you don't mind, we'd like a few minutes with Mr. Donovan," he said. Dr. Patel frowned. "5 minutes, no more, he needs rest." The officer nodded, then approached Ray's bed as the doctor left. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Deputy Harding. How are you feeling?" "Like I got chewed up by a shark," Ray replied dryly. A hint of a smile crossed the deputy's face. "Fair enough. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened, if you're up to it." Ray nodded, and for the next few minutes he recounted the events. The boat breakdown, the decision to swim back, encountering the tiger shark, and the attack itself. Deputy Harding took notes, occasionally asking for clarification. "We've already spoken to the men who rescued you, Jim Reeves and his brother-in-law. Their account matches yours," the deputy said when Ray had finished. "We've also been in touch with your employee, Ali Chen. She's been running interference with the press." The press? Ray hadn't considered the media implications. Local. News is all over this. First shark attack in the Upper Keys in almost 5 years. Some are already calling for increased beach patrols, shark nets, that sort of thing. Ray shook his head weakly. "The shark was just being a shark. I was in its territory." "That's what Ms. Chen has been telling reporters," Deputy Harding said with approval. "But you know how it is. Shark attacks sell papers." Before Ray could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway and Dr. Patel returned, looking irritated. "That's enough for now, Deputy. My patient needs rest." After the deputy left, Dr. Patel checked Ray's vitals and adjusted his pain medication. "You should try to sleep. Your body has been through extreme trauma and needs time to recover." As the medication began to take effect, Ray found himself drifting off, the steady beep of the heart monitor fading into the background. His last conscious thought was of his dive shop. How would it survive if he couldn't work for months? Would his clients find another operator? Would Ali stay on without him? These worries followed him into an uneasy sleep, where tiger-striped shadows moved through dark waters, always just at the edge of visibility. Ray spent 3 days in intensive care before being moved to a regular hospital room. During that time, he underwent a second surgery to further repair the damage to his calf muscle and had countless visits from doctors, nurses, and physical therapists, all outlining the long road to recovery ahead of him. Ali visited daily, bringing news from the dive shop and the outside world. She had managed to keep operations running with the help of Mike, who had expedited repairs on the main boat. Most clients had been understanding about the situation, especially once news of Ray's shark encounter spread. "You're something of a local celebrity now," Ali told him on the 4th day, showing him a copy of the Key West Citizen. There on the front page was a blurry photo of him being loaded into the ambulance, accompanied by the headline, "Local Dive Instructor Survives Tiger Shark Attack." "Great," Ray muttered, scanning the article. It was sensationalized but mostly accurate, emphasizing the rarity of shark attacks and including quotes from marine biologists about tiger shark behavior. There was also a sidebar about the increase in tiger shark sightings in the Keys over the past year, which some experts attributed to changing water temperatures and feeding patterns. "There's something else," Ali said, her expression growing more serious. "Channel 7 from Miami wants to interview you. They're doing a special report on shark encounters in Florida waters." Ray shook his head. "Not interested." "They're offering money," Ali pressed, "which, considering your medical bills and the business situation, might be worth considering." She had a point. Ray had health insurance, but he knew the deductibles, and co-pays would still be substantial. And while the dive shop was continuing to operate, bookings had already started to decline, partly due to the seasonal slowdown that always began in late August, but also, Ray suspected, because some potential clients might be spooked by his experience. "I'll think about it," he conceded. "But I'm not interested in painting sharks as monsters. That's not what happened out there." "I know," Ali assured him. "I've been very clear with everyone who asks that you don't blame the shark." After Ali left, Ray had another visitor. Jim Reeves, one of the fishermen who had rescued him, thought I'd check in, see how you're doing, Jim said, standing awkwardly at the foot of Ray's bed, a small potted plant in his hands. "Brought you this. Not sure if you're a plant guy, but my wife insisted." "Thanks," Ray said, genuinely moved. "And thank you again for saving my life. If you and your brother-in-law hadn't come along when you did, Jim shrugged off the gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. We were just in the right place. They talked for a while about fishing in the Keys, about the increasing number of tourists each year, about the changing patterns of marine life they'd both observed. Jim mentioned that he'd been fishing the Keys for over 30 years and had seen more tiger sharks in the past 2 years than in the previous decade. Something's changing out there, he said thoughtfully. Water's warmer, fish patterns are different, sharks are just following the food. After Jim left, Ray had his daily session with the physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Diane who pushed him harder than he thought possible given his injuries. The pain was excruciating, but Ray understood the necessity. The more mobility he could maintain now, the better his chances for a fuller recovery later. That evening, Dr. Patel visited with news. We're looking at discharging you in 3 days. If your progress continues at this rate, you'll need home health care for a while and intensive outpatient physical therapy. Can I go back to my apartment? Ray asked. The thought of navigating stairs and narrow doorways on crutches seemed daunting. That depends. Does it have wheelchair access? You'll be non-weight-bearing on that leg for at least 6 weeks. Ray's heart sank. His second-floor walk-up was definitely not wheelchair-friendly. Seeing his expression, Dr. Patel continued, there are short-term rehabilitation facilities that might be appropriate, or perhaps you have a friend with a more accessible home. Ray promised to figure something out, but after the doctor left, he stared at the ceiling. Another worry added to his growing list. He had built his life around physical capability, swimming, diving, carrying heavy equipment. The prospect of weeks or months of dependency was almost as frightening as the shark encounter itself. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Donovan, this is Sarah Marshall from the Monroe County Marine Conservation Committee. We'd like to discuss your recent shark encounter. Please call when convenient. Ray frowned, setting the phone aside without responding. He wasn't interested in becoming a poster child for any cause, conservation or otherwise. He just wanted to heal, to get back to his life, to put the whole terrifying experience behind him. But as he drifted off to sleep that night, images of the attack kept replaying in his mind. The tiger shark's approach, the sudden, devastating impact, the cold black eye staring at him without emotion or malice. He woke repeatedly, sweating and disoriented, the phantom sensation of teeth tearing into his flesh so vivid that he had to touch his bandaged leg to reassure himself it was still there. On the 7th day after the attack, Ray was discharged from the hospital. The problem of where he would stay had been solved by Mike, who offered the ground-floor guest room in his house in Key Largo, about 5 miles from Ray's apartment and the dive shop. The transition from hospital to Mike's house was awkward and painful. Ray was confined to a wheelchair most of the time, with limited crutch use permitted for essential transfers. The wounds on his leg required daily dressing changes, performed by a home health nurse who visited each morning. Physical therapy appointments were scheduled 3 times a week at a rehabilitation center in Tavernier. Mike had converted his guest room for Ray's use, installing grab bars in the adjacent bathroom and renting a hospital bed that made it easier for Ray to elevate his leg. Despite these accommodations, Ray found himself increasingly frustrated by his dependence and the glacial pace of his recovery. It's only been a week since you left the hospital, Mike reminded him after a particularly difficult physical therapy session that had left Ray in a dark mood. You can't expect to bounce back from something like this overnight. I know, Ray acknowledged. It's just, he gestured vaguely at his injured leg. My whole life, my business, everything depends on me being active, being in the water. Mike, a former Coast Guard officer who had seen his share of injuries and recoveries, nodded sympathetically but remained practical. So you adapt. Maybe you focus more on the business side for a while, let Ali handle more of the diving, or you hire another instructor. On what budget? Ray countered. Bookings are down 30% according to Ali, and my medical bills are piling up faster than insurance can process them. Speaking of which, Mike said, pulling an envelope from his pocket, this came for you at the shop. Ray opened it to find a check for $5,000 from Sea Star Charters, a competitor dive operation based in Islamorada, along with a handwritten note, Dive community takes care of its own. Get well soon, Captain Dave. The unexpected generosity brought a lump to Ray's throat. He had known Dave Simmons, Sea Star's owner, for years. They were friendly competitors who occasionally referred clients to each other when fully booked, but they weren't close friends. "There's more," Mike added, looking slightly uncomfortable. Channel 7 called again about that interview. "They've upped their offer to $10,000. Ray stared at the check in his hand, then at his leg, heavily bandaged and throbbing despite the pain medication. $10,000 would cover a significant portion of his out-of-pocket medical expenses. Tell them I'll do it, he decided. But on my terms. No sensationalism, no demonizing sharks. This was a random encounter, not some kind of revenge story. "I'll let them know," Mike promised. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving Ray time to prepare mentally. In the meantime, he focused on his recovery, pushing himself in physical therapy and working remotely on Dive Shop. Business when he had the energy. Ali brought paperwork and the shop laptop to Mike's house several times a week, updating Ray on operations and client bookings. "We've had 4 cancellations for next month," she reported during one visit, but also 3 new bookings specifically requesting the shark attack guy as their instructor. Ray groaned. "Is that my new identity? Shark attack guy?" Ali smiled sympathetically. "For now, maybe. But hey, we can use it to our advantage. I've been thinking about adding a shark awareness component to our conservation briefings. You know, educate people about shark behavior, the important role they play in marine ecosystems, turning trauma into an educational opportunity." Ray raised an eyebrow. "Something like that," Ali admitted. "People are curious. Might as well channel that curiosity into something positive." The day of the television interview arrived. The Channel 7 crew transformed Mike's living room into a makeshift studio, setting up lights, microphones, and cameras. The reporter, a polished woman named Jennifer Hayes, arrived with a makeup artist who did his best to make Ray look less pale and drawn from his weeks of recovery. Before the cameras rolled, Jennifer briefed Ray on the format. "We'll start with your background as a dive instructor, then move to the day of the attack. I'll ask about your recovery and future plans. We're especially interested in your perspective as someone who works in marine education. And as I told your producer," Ray emphasized, "I'm not interested in portraying sharks as mindless killers or calling for culls or nets or any of that nonsense." "Absolutely," Jennifer agreed readily. "Our angle is more about coexistence and education. In fact, we've also interviewed a marine biologist from the University of Miami who specializes in shark behavior. Her segments will be intercut with yours." The interview itself went smoothly. Ray recounted the events leading up to the attack, describing the encounter in detail, but careful to present it as an unfortunate random occurrence rather than a deliberate targeting. "I was in the shark's environment," he emphasized. "Tiger sharks are apex predators, and I presented as potential prey. There was nothing personal about it." Jennifer nodded, then asked the question Ray had been dreading. "Will you go back in the water? Return to diving?" Ray hesitated, aware of the cameras capturing his reaction. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "The doctors are optimistic about my recovery, but realistically, I'll never have the same level of mobility in my right leg. As for getting back in the ocean," he paused, surprised by the sudden tightness in his throat. "I want to say yes without hesitation. I've spent my adult life in love with the ocean and everything in it, including sharks. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't dealing with some psychological aftermath. PTSD is common among shark attack survivors," Jennifer noted. "I wouldn't call it PTSD," Ray corrected. "More like a new awareness of my own vulnerability. The ocean has always been dangerous, I've always known that. But now I've experienced that danger firsthand, in the most visceral way possible." After the interview concluded and the Channel 7 crew packed up their equipment, Jennifer handed Ray an envelope. "As agreed," she said, "the segment will air next Monday evening. We'll send you a link to the online version as well." Ray nodded, setting the envelope aside without opening it. Despite the financial necessity, there was something uncomfortable about being paid for sharing his trauma, as if he were monetizing the worst experience of his life. "One more thing," Jennifer added as she was leaving. "We've been in contact with the International Shark Attack File researchers at the University of Florida. They're documenting your case and would like to interview you as well, for scientific purposes." "I'll consider it," Ray said, though in truth he was growing tired of recounting the attack. Each retelling forced him to relive those terrifying moments, the sensation of teeth tearing into his flesh, the desperate struggle to survive. After the TV crew left, Ray wheeled himself out to Mike's back porch, which overlooked a small canal where a juvenile manatee was grazing on seagrass. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the chaos inside, both the physical disorder left by the television equipment and the emotional turmoil stirred up by revisiting his encounter. Mike joined him, handing him a cold beer. "How'd it go?" Ray shrugged. "Fine, I guess." Said what I needed to say. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the manatee's leisurely movements. Finally, Ray spoke again. "I had a dream last night. I was back in the water, diving the reef. Everything was normal, beautiful. Then I looked down and my leg was gone, just a bloody stump. But in the dream, I wasn't scared or upset. I just thought, that makes sense." Mike didn't respond immediately, taking a thoughtful sip of his beer. "Sounds like your brain processing what happened," he suggested eventually. "Working through the trauma." "Maybe," Ray conceded. "Or maybe, it's telling me something about my future." The following week brought more physical therapy, more paperwork from the dive shop, and a growing sense of restlessness. Ray had progressed to weight-bearing exercises with his injured leg, though the pain remained significant and the mobility severely limited. The physical therapist was pleased with his progress, but continued to emphasize that full recovery, if such a thing were possible, would take many months, possibly a year or more. On Monday evening, Ray, Mike, and Ali gathered in Mike's living room to watch the Channel 7 special report, Sharks of the Florida Keys, Predators or Misunderstood. The program was more balanced than Ray had feared. His interview was presented alongside segments featuring Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a shark behavior specialist from the University of Miami, who explained the rarity of shark attacks and the specific hunting patterns of tiger sharks. There were also interviews with other Keys residents about their perspectives on sharing waters with sharks. "They did a good job," Ali said when it concluded, "educational without being alarmist." The comments on their social media are another story, Mike noted, scrolling through his phone. "Half the people are calling for shark culls. The other half are saying Ray deserved it for invading their territory." "Let me see that," Ray said, reaching for the phone. The comments were indeed polarized, ranging from "these monsters need to be eliminated from our beaches" to "humans are the real predators, the oceans belong to sharks." "Don't read that crap," Ali advised, taking the phone from him. "Social media brings out the worst in people." The next morning, Ray had a visitor, Sarah Marshall from the Monroe County Marine Conservation Committee, who had texted him shortly after the attack. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with sun-bleached hair and the deep tan of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said, taking a seat on Mike's couch, while Ray sat across from her in his wheelchair. "I saw your interview last night. You did an excellent job of presenting a balanced perspective." "I just told my story," Ray said with a shrug. "No agenda either way." "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you," Sarah explained. "Our committee is developing new educational materials about shark safety for tourists and locals alike. Your experience, and more importantly, your attitude about it, could be valuable in shaping that message." "What kind of materials?" Ray asked cautiously. "Brochures, website content, maybe some signage at popular beaches and dive spots, basic information about shark species in our waters, their behaviors, tips for reducing risk, that sort of thing." "And you want what from me exactly?" "Your perspective as someone who's had a direct encounter," Sarah said, "and perhaps permission to reference your experience as a case study. We'd compensate you for your time, of course." Ray considered the offer. On one hand, he was growing weary of being shark attack guy. On the other, he did believe strongly in education rather than fear-mongering when it came to sharks. "I'll help," he decided, "but I want final approval on how my story is presented, and I want it to be clear that what happened to me was an extreme rarity, not something people should be constantly afraid of." "Absolutely," Sarah agreed readily. "That's exactly the message we want to convey. Respect, not fear." They spent the next hour discussing Ray's encounter in detail, not just the attack itself, but his knowledge of tiger sharks prior to the incident, his decision-making process during the encounter, and his reflections afterward. Sarah took notes and occasionally asked Ray to clarify specific points about the shark's behavior. "One thing I'm curious about," she said toward the end of their conversation, "do you think there was anything you could have done differently that might have prevented the attack?" Ray had asked himself the same question countless times during his recovery. Not swimming alone would have been a start, he admitted, and not taking the channel route, where deeper water makes shark encounters more likely. But honestly, once I was in the water and the shark showed interest, my options were limited. Maybe if I'd maintained my original course to shore instead of diverting to the patch reef. He shook his head. Hard to say, everything happened so fast. That's helpful, Sarah said. We want to include practical advice without suggesting that people can completely eliminate risk. After Sarah left, promising to keep in touch about the educational materials, Ray found himself thinking more deeply about the question she had posed. What could he have done differently? The obvious answer was never to have decided to swim back in the first place, a choice made partly from necessity due to the overloaded dinghy, but also partly from pride and overconfidence in his own abilities. That evening, Ray received an email from Jennifer at Channel 7, containing a link to the online version of the Shark Special and a note. Wanted to let you know the segment got our highest ratings this quarter. There's interest in a follow-up piece about your recovery journey if you're open to it. Ray closed the email without responding. While the money would be helpful, he wasn't sure he wanted to continue being defined by the worst day of his life. As September turned to October, Ray's recovery progressed steadily, if slowly. He graduated from wheelchair to walker, then to crutches, for short distances. The wounds on his leg had closed, leaving vivid red scars that the doctors assured him would fade somewhat with time, though they would never disappear completely. The damage to his calf muscle resulted in a pronounced limp that his physical therapist warned might be permanent. Throughout this time, Ray had been managing the dive shop remotely, with Ali handling the day-to-day operations and dive instruction. Business had stabilized. The initial drop in bookings following news of the attack had been offset by a different kind of clientele, those specifically interested in the dive shop owned by the shark attack survivor. It's weird, Ali reported, during one of her regular visits. People ask about you all the time, want to know details about the attack. Some of them even ask to see the exact spot where it happened. Great, Ray said dryly. We've become a shark attack tourism operation. It'll pass, Ali assured him. People have short attention spans. By next season, it'll be old news. Ray wasn't so sure. In a small community like Key Largo, where everyone knew everyone else's business, his identity as a shark attack survivor seemed likely to stick. Already on his infrequent ventures out of Mike's house for medical appointments, he had noticed the double takes and whispers from locals who recognized him from the news coverage. By mid-October, Ray felt ready to return to his apartment. While he still needed crutches to get around, he could now manage stairs carefully, and the independence of being in his own space outweighed the remaining physical challenges. Mike helped him move back in, installing additional grab bars in the bathroom and making sure essential items were within easy reach. The first night back in his own bed, Ray slept better than he had since before the attack. The familiar sounds of his neighborhood, the distant hum of boats on the channel, the occasional call of night birds, the soft rustle of palm fronds in the breeze, soothed him in a way that Mike's guest room never had. The next morning, he decided it was time to visit the dive shop in person. He hadn't been back since the day of the attack, and while he and Ali had discussed business matters extensively, he felt disconnected from the operation he had built over 15 years. The short drive to the marina was uneventful, though. Parking and navigating from the car to the shop on crutches proved more challenging than he had anticipated. When he finally pushed open the door, the familiar bell jingling above his head, he was surprised to find the shop busy with customers, a family of 4 being fitted for rental equipment by Ali, while Mike helped another couple browse the Pals retail section. Ali looked up at the sound of the bell, her face lighting up with surprise and delight. "Ray, you didn't tell me you were coming in today." The customers turned to stare, recognition dawning on their faces. Ray felt suddenly self-conscious about his crutches and the visible scars on his exposed calf. "Just thought I'd check in, see how things are going," he said, making his way to the counter and leaning against it to take weight off his injured leg. The father of the family being fitted approached him, hand extended. "You're Ray Donovan, right? The guy from the Shark Special on Channel 7? Man, what a story." Ray shook the man's hand, offering a tight smile. "That's me. We booked with your shop specifically after seeing that program," the man continued enthusiastically. "My kids are fascinated by sharks now. We're hoping to maybe see one during our dive. From a safe distance, of course," he laughed at his own joke. Well, shark sightings aren't guaranteed, Ray replied, falling back on his professional tone. But Ali here will make sure you have a great experience regardless. After the customers left, Ali approached Ray with concern. You okay? You seemed uncomfortable with that guy. Ray sighed, lowering himself carefully onto the stool behind the counter. Just getting used to being a local curiosity, I guess. Never expected to be famous for almost getting eaten. For what it's worth, bookings are up 20% from this time last year, Mike offered, joining them at the counter. Silver lining and all that. Great, Ray said without enthusiasm. We're profiting from my trauma. That's not fair, Ali protested. We're still offering the same quality diving experiences we always have. If your story brought people in, that's just good publicity. Ray knew she was right, but he couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling. He had always seen blue water diving as offering authentic, respectful interactions with the marine environment. The idea of capitalizing on a shark attack seemed at odds with that mission. Anyway, he said, changing the subject, show me how things have been running. I want to get caught up on everything. For the next few hours, Ray immersed himself in the operational details of the shop, reviewing booking schedules, equipment maintenance logs, and financial reports. The business was indeed doing well, perhaps even better than if the attack had never happened. Ali had proven herself more than capable of handling the instructional side, and Mike had taken on additional responsibilities with boat operations and equipment maintenance. You've built a solid operation here, Mike observed as they reviewed the books. It can run without you being in the water every day. There was something both comforting and unsettling about that realization. Ray had always defined himself primarily as a diver who happened to run a business, not a business owner who happened to dive. The distinction felt important somehow. As the day wound down and Ali closed the shop, she suggested they all go for dinner at the Fish House, a popular local restaurant. To celebrate your first day back, she explained. Ray hesitated, still self-conscious about appearing in public with his crutches and visible injuries, but the alternative, returning to his empty apartment, seemed suddenly depressing. Sure, he agreed, but let's get a table in the back. At the restaurant, Ray was immediately reminded of his new local celebrity status when the hostess recognized him and loudly welcomed our local shark survivor. Several diners turned to stare, a few even taking discreet photos with their phones. By the time they were seated, Ray was regretting his decision to come. Ignore them, Ali advised, noticing his discomfort. People are just curious. Their server approached, a young man with a Florida Keys Community College t-shirt. Mr. Donovan, he said, my marine biology professor showed us your interview in class last week. We're studying shark behavior this semester. Glad it was educational, Ray replied, trying to sound more enthusiastic than he felt. The meal progressed more pleasantly after that initial awkwardness. Ray found himself genuinely enjoying the company of Mike and Ali, the fresh seafood, and the familiar ambience of the restaurant he had frequented for years. For brief stretches, he was able to forget about the attack and his injuries to feel almost normal again. As they were finishing their key lime pie, Ray's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Marshall. Educational materials draft ready. For your review, can I stop by tomorrow? Work? Mike asked, noticing Ray's attention to his phone. Sort of. That conservation committee wants me to review some shark safety materials they're developing. You going to do it? Ray considered the question. Despite his mixed feelings about his new identity as a shark attack survivor, he still believed strongly in education rather than fear. If his experience could help shape a balanced message about shark awareness, perhaps some good could come from his ordeal. Yeah, he decided. I think I will. The next day, Sarah arrived at Ray's apartment with a folder of draft materials, brochures, poster designs, and website, content focused on shark awareness and safety in the Florida Keys. The materials were informative without being alarmist, emphasizing the rarity of attacks while providing practical safety tips for divers, swimmers, and boaters. We've included your story here, Sarah said, pointing to a section titled Survivor Perspective, but I want to make sure you're comfortable with how it's presented. Ray read through the text, which summarized his encounter factually, and included several quotes from his Channel 7 interview about respecting the marine environment and understanding shark behavior. It portrayed him as a knowledgeable marine, professional with an unfortunate but balanced perspective on his experience. It's good, he acknowledged, surprised by the even-handedness of the presentation. Better than I expected, honestly. "We're not interested in sensationalizing," Sarah assured him. "Just educating." As they continued reviewing the materials, Ray found himself warming to the project. This wasn't exploitation of his trauma, it was channeling that experience into something potentially valuable for others. By the time Sarah left, promising to incorporate his few suggested changes before finalizing the materials, Ray felt more positive about his involvement than he had about anything since the attack. That evening, sitting on his small balcony watching the sunset over the marina, Ray made a decision. He called Ali. "I've been thinking," he said when she answered, "about the dive shop and my role going forward." "Okay," she replied cautiously. "What kind of thinking?" "I'm not going to be diving professionally again anytime soon, if ever," he stated, the words difficult but necessary to voice aloud. "My leg is healing, but the doctors are pretty clear that I'll never have the same strength or mobility. Even if I wanted to push through that, the liability insurance company would have a fit." "Ray, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "You've been running the instruction side of things for months now, and doing a great job by all accounts. I'm thinking it's time to make that permanent, promote you to head instructor, with a pay increase to match." "Are you sure?" Ali sounded surprised but not displeased. "Absolutely, you've more than earned it. I'll focus on the business side, marketing, client relations, all that stuff I never had enough time for when I was diving every day." "What? About your getting back in the water? For recreation, I mean." Ray hesitated. This was the question he had been asking himself for weeks. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Part of me thinks I need to, just to prove to myself that I can, that I'm not going to let one bad day define the rest of my life. But another part is scared," Ali finished for him. "That's completely understandable, Ray. No one would blame you if you never went in the ocean again." "But I'd blame myself," Ray said quietly. "The ocean has been the center of my life for 15 years. I can't imagine never experiencing that again. So take it slow. Maybe start with just wading in at the beach, then snorkeling in shallow water, baby steps." Ray smiled at her practical approach. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," she replied. "So we have a deal? I run the diving, you run the business? We have a deal." After hanging up, Ray remained on the balcony, watching as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon. The channel waters turned from golden to deep blue, then to black as twilight gave way to night. Somewhere out there, beyond the protected shallows of the Keys, tiger sharks were hunting in the darkness, following the same instincts they had, possessed for millions of years. Ray touched the scars on his leg absently, feeling the ridged tissue beneath his fingers. He had been marked, permanently altered by his encounter, but perhaps being marked didn't have to mean being defined by that mark. 2 days later, Ray stood at the edge of a small, protected beach near his apartment, the gentle waves lapping at the sand just inches from his feet. He had driven here alone, determined that this first step back toward the water would be a private moment, without witnesses or expectations. He leaned on his crutches, staring at the clear, shallow water. Intellectually, he knew there was no danger here. The water was barely knee-deep, the bottom clearly visible, the protected cove separated from the deeper channel where sharks might patrol. Yet his heart raced and his mouth had gone dry. "Just one step," he murmured to himself. "Just get your feet wet." A family with young children played further down the beach, the kids splashing happily in the shallows without a care in the world. Their innocent joy in the water made Ray's own hesitation feel all the more frustrating. Taking a deep breath, he shifted his weight and moved his right foot forward, the one with the most severe injuries. The cool water washed over his toes, then his foot, then his ankle, sending an involuntary shiver up his spine that had nothing to do with temperature. He stood there, one foot in the water, for nearly a minute, forcing himself to breathe deeply and notice the pleasant sensation rather than give in to the anxiety bubbling just beneath the surface. Then slowly he moved the other foot forward as well, so that both feet were submerged. It wasn't much, hardly a triumphant return to the ocean he had once considered his second home, but it was a beginning, a small act of defiance against the fear that had taken root since the attack. Ray didn't venture any deeper that day. He simply stood at the water's edge for perhaps 15 minutes, letting the small waves wash around his ankles, reconnecting with the element that had shaped his adult life. When he finally turned to make his way back to the car, he felt a curious mixture of accomplishment and disappointment. proud that he had taken this first step, yet acutely aware of how far he still had to go. Over the next 2 weeks, Ray continued these brief excursions to the beach, gradually venturing deeper, first to his knees, then to his waist. The physical therapist had encouraged water therapy anyway, noting that the buoyancy would be good for his recovering muscles while reducing strain on his injured leg. He didn't tell anyone about these solitary visits to the beach, not even Ali or Mike. Something about the process felt intensely personal, a private reckoning between himself and the ocean that had simultaneously given him his life's purpose and nearly taken his life. November arrived, bringing slightly cooler temperatures to the Keys and the official end of hurricane season. Ray had settled into a new routine: mornings at the dive shop handling administrative tasks, afternoons dedicated to physical therapy, and his private ocean visits, evenings often spent with Mike, Ali, or alone at his apartment. The shark awareness materials that Sarah had shown him began appearing around Key Largo: brochures at tourist information centers, posters at popular beaches and marinas, content on local tourism websites. Ray was pleasantly surprised by the community's generally positive response. There had been no calls for shark culls or protective nets, just an increased interest in understanding these apex predators. One Wednesday afternoon, after finishing his physical therapy session, Ray drove to his usual beach spot, but today he had brought something different: a mask and snorkel. He wasn't ready to fully submerge yet, but the idea of at least looking beneath the surface had been growing in his mind. The beach was nearly deserted, just an elderly couple walking along the shoreline some distance away. Ray made his way to the water's edge, now using only a single crutch for support on the uneven sand. His limp was still pronounced, but his balance had improved significantly over the past weeks. He waded in to waist depth, the water calm and clear. For several minutes he simply stood there, working up his courage. Then, taking a deep breath, he put on the mask, adjusted the snorkel, and leaned forward, placing his face in the water. The familiar underwater world came into view: sand, scattered patches of seagrass, small fish darting about. The simple act of looking beneath the surface sent a rush of conflicting emotions through him: joy at reconnecting with this environment, anxiety at the memory of what had happened the last time he was submerged in ocean water, and a deep, persistent longing for the way things used to be. Ray stayed there, floating with his face in the water, for perhaps 5 minutes before standing upright again. It wasn't diving, not even close, but it was something. Another small step. As he was preparing to leave the beach, he noticed a familiar figure walking toward him: Sarah Marshall, carrying a folder similar to the one she had brought to his apartment. "Ray!" she called, clearly surprised to see him. "I was just on my way to find you. The harbor master said you might be at the dive shop." "Just getting some water therapy," Ray explained, gesturing vaguely at the ocean. "Doctor's orders." Sarah nodded, her expression a mixture of understanding and something else. Admiration, perhaps. That's really great. How does it feel?" "Scary," Ray admitted, "but necessary. What's in the folder?" "Oh, right." She seemed to remember her purpose. "The final versions of the materials. They've been distributed around the county, and the response has been pretty positive so far. I thought you might want copies for your shop." They sat on a nearby bench while Ray reviewed the materials. The brochures and posters looked professional, with excellent underwater photography of various shark species found in Florida waters, including tiger sharks. Ray's story was presented exactly as they had discussed: factual and educational rather than sensational. "These are good," he said sincerely. "I'll definitely put them in the shop." "There's something else," Sarah said, hesitating slightly. "The committee is organizing an educational event at the Murray E. Nelson Government Center next month. Presentations about marine conservation, including a segment on shark awareness. We were hoping you might consider speaking briefly about your experience." Ray's immediate instinct was to refuse. The idea of standing on a stage recounting his attack to a room full of strangers seemed like a step backward in his recovery, a reinforcement of his identity as shark attack guy, just when he was trying to move beyond it. Seeing his hesitation, Sarah added, "It would be completely on your terms, as long or short as you want, focused on whatever aspects you're comfortable discussing, and it would be alongside scientific presentations, not as some kind of sensationalized main event." "I'll think about it," Ray promised, not wanting to commit either way. After Sarah left, Ray remained on the bench watching the gentle waves and considering her request. Part of him was tired of talking about the attack, of being defined by the worst day of his life. But another part recognized the potential value in sharing his perspective, not just for public education, but perhaps for his own healing process as well. The next day at the dive shop, Ray discussed the speaking invitation with Ali and Mike during a quiet moment between clients. "I think you should do it," Ali said immediately. "The more people understand sharks, the better for everyone, including the sharks." "Maybe," Ray acknowledged, "but I'm not sure I want to keep being known primarily as the guy who got attacked." "So don't talk about the attack," Mike suggested. "Or at least don't make that the focus. Talk about your 15 years of diving in these waters, the hundreds of peaceful shark encounters you had before this one bad day. Put it in perspective." Ray considered this approach. It hadn't occurred to him that he could use this platform to tell a broader story, one that included but wasn't dominated by the attack. "That could work," he admitted. "Make it about coexistence rather than conflict." "Exactly," Ali agreed enthusiastically. "And honestly, Ray, you have credibility now that most marine educators don't. You can say, respect sharks, but don't fear them unnecessarily, and people will listen because you've been through the worst-case scenario and still maintain that balanced view." In the end, Ray agreed to participate in the event, with the understanding that he would focus on his overall experience with sharks throughout his diving career, not just the attack itself. Sarah was delighted when he called to accept, promising to work with him on the exact format and content of his presentation. As November progressed, Ray continued his gradual return to the water. He had now progressed to fully submerging while snorkeling in shallow, protected areas. He still experienced moments of panic, a shadow passing beneath him, a sudden movement in his peripheral vision, but these episodes were becoming less frequent and less intense. One significant milestone came when Ali invited him to join her and a client group for a shallow reef snorkel near the shore. Ray would remain on the boat, not participating in the activity itself, but it would be his first time back on the water over a reef since the attack. The morning of the excursion dawned clear and calm, perfect conditions for snorkeling. Ray felt a flutter of anxiety as he boarded the boat, not the main vessel, which was out with another group, but the backup boat which had finally been repaired. Being on a small boat again, preparing to head out to a reef, brought back vivid memories of that fateful day in August. "You okay?" Ali asked quietly as Mike prepared to cast off. "Fine," Ray assured her, though his white-knuckle grip on the gunwale suggested otherwise. Just taking it all in. The clients, a family of 4 from Ohio, were excitedly preparing their snorkel gear, unaware of the significance of this trip for Ray. He had deliberately kept a low profile, introducing himself simply as one of the shop owners without mentioning his history. As they motored out to the snorkel site, a shallow patch reef about a quarter-mile offshore, Ray gradually relaxed. The familiar sensation of the boat moving through the water, the salt spray on his face, the expansive blue sky overhead, all of it felt right somehow, like returning to a part of himself he had feared might be lost forever. When they arrived at the site, Ali gave the standard safety briefing while Mike secured the boat to a mooring buoy. The family entered the water, one by one, with Ali following last to supervise. Ray watched them from the boat, feeling a strange mixture of envy and contentment, wishing he could join them, yet satisfied to at least be here, on the water, participating in some capacity. For the next hour, Ray sat on the boat with Mike, occasionally catching glimpses of the snorkelers when they surfaced. The reef below was visible from his vantage point, the water so clear that he could make out the larger coral formations and the occasional flash of colorful fish. "Miss it?" Mike asked during a comfortable silence. "Every day," Ray admitted. "But this is nice too, being out here, even if I'm not in the water." "You'll get there," Mike said with quiet confidence. "Maybe not tomorrow or next month, but eventually." Ray nodded, wanting to believe him. "It's strange. I spent years diving with sharks, seeing them fairly regularly, never giving it a second thought. Now one bad experience has overshadowed all the good ones," Mike finished for him. "That's how trauma works, but it doesn't have to be permanent." "Voice of experience?" Mike nodded slowly. "Coast Guard service. Had a rescue go bad during a hurricane, lost 2 civilians, nearly drowned myself, couldn't get on a boat for 6 months afterward." He paused, gazing out at the horizon. "But I got past it eventually. not by forgetting but by building new experiences to balance out the bad one. This insight stayed with Ray long after they returned to shore. Building new experiences to balance out the bad one. That made sense. He couldn't erase the attack or its physical and psychological impacts, but perhaps he could create enough new, positive experiences in and around the water that the attack would become just one event among many, not the defining moment that colored everything else. December arrived, bringing with it the holiday season and an uptick in tourists escaping winter weather in the northern states. The dive shop was busy, with both the primary boat and the repaired backup vessel going out daily, sometimes twice a day. Ray continued to handle the business side, while Ali managed the diving operations, an arrangement that was working smoothly for everyone involved. The educational event at the government center was scheduled for December 15th. As the date approached, Ray worked with Sarah on his presentation, developing a brief talk that would touch on his attack, but focus primarily on his broader experience with sharks throughout his diving career and the importance of understanding rather than fearing these essential marine predators. The night before the event, Ray found himself unable to sleep, partly from nervousness about public speaking, but more from a sense that he was approaching another significant milestone in his recovery journey. Talking about the attack in this context, educational, constructive, balanced, felt like reclaiming the narrative, refusing to let it be defined solely by trauma and fear. At the government center the next evening, the meeting room was filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. Ray, waiting in a side room with the other presenters, was stunned by the turnout. "Word. Got around that you were speaking," Sarah explained when she came to check on him. "A lot of locals want to hear your story firsthand, without the TV news filter." The event began with a marine biologist from the University of Miami giving an overview of shark species in Florida waters, their behaviors, and their ecological importance. This was followed by a representative from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission discussing management strategies and current research. Then it was Ray's turn. As he made his way to the podium, leaning slightly on his cane, he had graduated from crutches 2 weeks earlier. The room fell silent. Ray surveyed the audience, recognizing many familiar faces: other dive operators, local fishermen, tourists he had taken diving in previous seasons, and at the back, Ali and Mike offering encouraging smiles. "My name is Ray Donovan," he began, his voice steadier than he had expected. "And as some of you know, on August 12th of this year, I had an encounter with a tiger shark that nearly cost me my life." He paused, letting that statement sink in. Then he continued, "But that's not really what I'm here to talk about tonight. I'm here to tell you about the thousands of dives I've done in these waters over the past 15 years, about the dozens of sharks I've encountered peacefully, about the respect I've always had for these animals, a respect that has only deepened, not diminished, since my attack." For the next 20 minutes, Ray shared stories of his diving career, the beauty and wonder he had experienced beneath the waves, the occasional shark sightings that had always been highlights rather than sources of fear. He explained the rarity of shark attacks, the specific circumstances that had contributed to his encounter, and the perspective he had gained through his recovery. "The shark that attacked me wasn't evil or malicious," he emphasized. "It was simply being a shark, a predator doing what millions of years of evolution designed it to do. I was in its environment, not the other way around." He concluded by removing his cane from where he had hooked it on the podium and holding it up. "This and the scars on my leg are reminders not of what I lost that day, but of what I gained. A deeper understanding of my place in the natural world, a renewed appreciation for the time I've spent in the ocean, and a commitment to sharing that perspective with others." The applause when he finished was overwhelming, many in the audience rising to their feet. Ray made his way back to his seat, emotionally drained but strangely exhilarated. For the first time since the attack, he felt like he had taken control of the narrative, reshaping it from a story of victimhood to one of understanding and resilience. After the presentations concluded, many audience members approached Ray to shake his hand, share their own experiences with sharks, or simply thank him for his perspective. One gray-haired woman grasped his hand firmly and said, "My grandson wants to be a marine biologist, but he's been scared of the water since hearing about shark attacks on the news. I'm bringing him to your shop for lessons next summer." By the time Ray finally made it outside to where Ali and Mike were waiting, he was exhausted, but content in a way he hadn't felt since before the attack. "You were amazing," Ali told him, giving him a careful hug. "I've never heard you speak so eloquently." "Near-death experiences have a way of clarifying your thoughts," Ray joked, but there was truth behind the humor. The attack and its aftermath had forced him to examine his relationship with the ocean, with marine life, and with his own identity in ways he never would have otherwise. "Celebration dinner?" Mike suggested. "My treat." They went to the fish house again, but this time Ray didn't mind when people recognized him or approached their table. The identity of shark attack survivor no longer felt like a burden, but rather just one aspect of who he was. A diver, a business owner, an educator, and yes, someone with a unique perspective on sharks. As they ate, Ray shared a decision he had been contemplating for several days. "I think I'm ready to try diving again. Not professionally, not yet anyway, but a shallow, controlled dive. Maybe at the underwater park at John Pennekamp. Crystal clear water, plenty of other divers around, no deep drop-offs." Ali and Mike exchanged surprised glances. "Are you sure?" Ali asked. "That's a big step from snorkeling." "I'm sure," Ray confirmed. "It's time. I need to know if I can still do it, still feel comfortable underwater." He paused, then added, "And I'd like you both to come with me, if you're willing." "Of course," Mike said immediately. "Just name the day." "After the holiday rush," Ray decided. "Early January, when things slow down a bit." They spent the rest of the evening discussing the plan, potential dive sites within the marine sanctuary, equipment considerations given Ray's limited mobility. For the first time since the attack, Ray found himself looking forward to something, dive-related with anticipation rather than anxiety. The holiday season passed in a blur of activity at the dive shop. Ray continued his water therapy, progressing to longer snorkeling sessions and even brief free dives to about 10 feet in the protected cove near his apartment. Each small advance built his confidence for the planned scuba dive in January. On January 5th, the day finally arrived. They had chosen a weekday to avoid crowds, and a site within John Pennekamp Coral Reef State Park, known as the Nursery, a shallow reef area with maximum depths of about 20 feet, protected from currents and swells with excellent visibility. Ray had spent hours preparing, checking and rechecking his dive gear, which had sat unused since August. He had modified some equipment to accommodate his reduced leg mobility, custom fins that required less kicking power, additional weights on his right side to compensate for the muscle loss in his leg, and a slightly more buoyant wetsuit. When they arrived at the park and began setting up their equipment on the dive boat, Ray felt a familiar combination of excitement and pre-dive jitters, but with an additional layer of anxiety that was new and directly tied to the attack. His hands shook slightly as he assembled his regulator and attached it to his tank. "We can postpone if you're not ready," Ali offered quietly, noticing his trembling fingers. "No," Ray said firmly. "It's normal to be nervous. I'd be nervous. Even if the attack had never happened. First dive in months using modified equipment, it's a lot." Mike, who was serving as boat captain rather than diving, helped them both gear up. As Ray sat on the edge of the boat preparing to make a backward roll entry, he took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "Remember," Ali said, "we go down to 15 feet, no deeper for this first dive. If at any point you want to surface, signal me, no questions asked." Ray nodded, adjusted his mask one final time, secured his regulator, and rolled backward into the water. The initial shock of immersion sent a jolt of panic through him, instinctive, immediate, but he forced himself to focus on his training. Regulator secure, breathing normal, buoyancy positive for surface work. Ali entered the water beside him, giving him the OK signal with her hand. Ray returned it, not entirely honestly. He was breathing too rapidly, verging on hyperventilation, his body remembering the trauma, even as his mind tried to stay rational. They hung at the surface for several minutes, while Ray concentrated on slowing his breathing and calming his heart rate. Ali waited patiently, occasionally giving him reassuring hand signals, but otherwise letting him work through the process at his own pace. Finally, Ray felt ready to descend. He signaled to Ali, then deflated his BCD slightly, allowing himself to sink just below the surface. The familiar sensation of entering the underwater world, the sudden quiet, the weightlessness, the three-dimensional, environment brought both joy and apprehension. They descended slowly to about 10 feet, stopping there to equalize and assess. Ray's modified equipment was working well, compensating for his reduced kick strength. His buoyancy control, always one of his strengths as a diver, remained good despite the long break and physical changes. Ali signaled again. Okay? Ray considered the question honestly this time. His initial panic had subsided, replaced by a heightened awareness of his surroundings that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't the comfortable familiarity he had once felt either. He signaled back. Okay. They continued their descent to 15 feet, then began a slow exploration of the reef. The nursery lived up to its name, with abundant juvenile fish darting among colorful coral formations. Under different circumstances, Ray would have been entranced by the marine life, pointing out interesting species to his dive buddy. Today, however, his attention was split between the underwater environment and his own psychological state, monitoring his reactions and emotions with the same vigilance he applied to his air consumption and buoyancy. About 15 minutes into the dive, a large barracuda appeared at the edge of visibility, its distinctive silhouette unmistakable. Ray felt his heart rate spike, his breathing quicken. Intellectually, he knew barracuda posed minimal threat to divers, but the predator's presence triggered an involuntary stress response. Ali noticed both the barracuda and Ray's reaction. She moved closer to him, making eye contact through their masks, her expression calm and reassuring. Ray forced himself to breathe slowly, to acknowledge the fear without being controlled by it. After a few moments, the barracuda lost interest and swam away, and Ray's pulse gradually returned to normal. They continued the dive for another 20 minutes before Ray signaled that he was ready to ascend. They rose slowly to their safety stop at 15 feet, then to the surface, where Mike was waiting with the boat. "How was it?" Mike called as they approached. Ray removed his regulator, considering the question. "Different," he answered honestly. "Good in some ways, challenging in others. But I did it." Back on the boat, as they removed their gear and stored it, Ali asked for more details. "What was the hardest part?" "The barracuda," Ray admitted. "Seeing a predator, even one I've encountered hundreds of times before without concern, it triggered something." "But you worked through it," she pointed out. "You didn't panic, didn't abort the dive?" "No," Ray agreed, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. "I didn't." "Want to try again tomorrow?" Mike asked. "Different site, maybe." Ray considered the offer. The dive had been mentally exhausting, bringing up emotions and reactions he was still processing. But it had also been a crucial step in his recovery, a necessary reconnection with the underwater world that had shaped so much of his life. "Yes," he decided, "but let's go to Molasses Reef." Mike and Ali exchanged surprised glances. "Molasses?" Mike repeated. "That's where it all started," Ray finished for him. "I know. That's why I need to go there." The next day dawned clear and calm, perfect conditions for diving. As they approached Molasses Reef on the shop's main boat, Ray stood at the bow scanning the water. From the surface, there was nothing to distinguish this area from any other patch of ocean. No visible marker of the life-changing event that had occurred here almost 5 months earlier. They moored at a buoy on the reef's western edge, away from the exact spot where Ray had begun his ill-fated swim. Still, being in such proximity to the attack site sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the January air temperature. "Still sure about this?" Mike asked as they prepared their gear. Ray nodded, though with less confidence than he would have liked. "I need to do this. It's like reclaiming the space." The dive itself was deeper than the previous days, about 30 feet at its maximum depth. Ray felt the increased pressure not just physically but psychologically, a subtle reminder of vulnerability. Yet the reef's beauty was undeniable, the water clarity exceptional even by Keys standards. They encountered no sharks during the 40-minute dive, though Ray found himself constantly scanning the blue water beyond the reef's edge, half expecting to see a tiger-striped shape materializing from the depths. The anticipation itself was therapeutic in a way, forcing him to confront the fear directly rather than avoiding it. When they surfaced, Ray felt a profound sense of closure. The site of his worst nightmare had been transformed, not back to the carefree diving location it had once been, but into something new, a place of respect, awareness, and cautious appreciation. "How do you feel?" Ali asked as they climbed back aboard the boat. Ray considered the question carefully before answering. "Like I've taken back some control. It won't ever be the same. I won't ever be the same. But that's okay. Different doesn't have to mean worse. Over the following weeks, Ray continued diving regularly, gradually increasing depth and complexity, always with Ali or other experienced dive buddies. Each successful dive built his confidence, though he suspected he would always retain a heightened awareness, a respect for the ocean's power that bordered on caution. In late February, Sarah Marshall contacted him again, this time with news. The educational materials we developed have been so well received that the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission wants to adapt them for statewide use. They'd like to include your story, with your permission, of course. Ray agreed readily, pleased that his experience might contribute to a broader understanding of shark behavior and ocean safety throughout Florida. Around the same time, he made a significant business decision. After discussions with Ali and Mike, he decided to add a new educational component to Blue Water Diving's offerings, a shark awareness specialty course that would combine classroom sessions on shark behavior and conservation with controlled dives specifically focused on responsible shark observation. "Are you sure about this?" Mike had asked when Ray first proposed the idea. "Seems like a pretty direct confrontation with what happened." "That's exactly why I want to do it," Ray explained. "Not to exploit the attack, but to transform it into something constructive. If divers learn to understand sharks better, to interact with them more safely and respectfully, maybe fewer people will go through what I did." The course launched in March, with Ray handling the classroom portions while Ali led the diving components. To everyone's surprise, it quickly became one of the shop's most popular offerings, attracting both experienced divers interested in shark encounters and novices wanting to overcome their fears. As spring turned to summer, Ray continued his physical recovery. The limp remained, as the doctors had predicted, but his overall strength and mobility improved significantly. He still used a cane for longer walks or when particularly tired, but could manage without it for routine activities around the shop and on the boat. His psychological recovery progressed similarly, significant improvement, but with permanent changes. He no longer experienced panic attacks when diving, but maintained a vigilance, a constant awareness of his surroundings underwater that hadn't been necessary before. In many ways, this made him a better diver, and certainly a more effective instructor for the shark awareness courses. On August 12th, the one-year anniversary of the attack, Ray made a private pilgrimage back to the exact location where it had occurred. This time he dove alone, against standard safety protocols, but necessary for what he needed to do. Mike remained on the boat above, concerned but understanding. Ray descended to 60 feet, hovering in the blue water over the channel where the tiger shark had first appeared below him. He carried a small waterproof plaque he had commissioned, with a simple inscription, 12th of August 2024, a moment of learning in a lifetime of respect. He secured the plaque to a small concrete weight and placed it on the sandy bottom, not as a monument to trauma, but as a marker of transformation. As he watched it settle, a sense of peace washed over him, not forgetting, but accepting, integrating. On the surface again, Mike helped him back aboard the boat. "Saw anything down there?" he asked casually, though they both knew the question's deeper significance. "No sharks today," Ray replied with a small smile. "Just blue water and sunshine." As they motored back toward shore, Ray stood at the bow, feeling the warm Florida breeze on his face. Somewhere beneath the surface, the tiger shark that had attacked him was likely still patrolling these waters, following the ancient instincts that had made it such a perfect predator. Ray no longer harbored anger or fear toward that specific shark or sharks in general. Instead, he felt a complex mixture of respect, caution, and acceptance, recognition that humans and sharks shared these waters, two species with very different needs and perceptions, occasionally intersecting with dramatic consequences. The scars on his leg would remain forever, physical reminders of that intersection, but the psychological scars had begun to heal, to be absorbed into the broader tapestry of his experience. He was still Ray Donovan, diver and instructor, lover of the ocean and its creatures. The attack had changed him, but not defined him. As the shoreline of Key Largo came into view, Ray thought about the classes he would teach tomorrow, the dives he would lead next week, the ongoing work of the dive shop he had built over 16 years. Life continued, altered but unbroken, like the endless cycle of tides and currents that shaped the Keys themselves. The shark, meanwhile, swam on, neither malevolent nor merciful, simply existing as nature had designed it, a perfect predator, in an imperfect world, where humans and sharks would continue their uneasy coexistence for as long as both species endured.